What if devotion to saints, practiced by millions for centuries, concealed a secret that the Vatican itself is still trying to decipher? Imagine for a moment that each lit candle, each touched image, each murmured prayer in the name of a saint carried something much deeper than faith, perhaps a spiritual code, a link between the human and the divine that has been distorted over the centuries. From the oldest cathedrals to the small chapels hidden in villages, the sound of prayers to the saints echoes like an eternal chant. People kneel, light candles, weep, plead. They believe that these celestial intermediaries can hear, intercede, act. But what if this unwavering faith concealed a truth that the Vatican has kept in the shadows? What if devotion to the saints was, in part, a mirror of something that should never have been reflected? The Church has always taught that saints are examples of virtue, servants of God, intercessors for humanity. But quietly, within the stone walls of the Vatican, theologians and historians have begun to question how pure this practice truly is. What is the limit between veneration and worship? At what point does sincere prayer transform into disguised idolatry? The public needs to understand that we are not talking about popular superstition, but about a millennial structure built with theological precision and mystery. Each saint has a name, a story, an attributed power. Saint Rita, the impossible; Saint George, the warrior; Saint Francis, the peacemaker, and all of them in some way occupy a space between man and God. But what happens when that space expands too much? When the saint occupies the Creator's throne within the human heart? For centuries, theologians have tried to answer this question. Some claim that praying to the saints is seeking help from those already in the divine presence. Others, however, see this as a dangerous deviation, a transfer of faith. And this is where the revelation that shook the foundations of the Holy See comes in. A Vatican expert, after decades of studying secret documents and ancient texts, decided to break the silence. He claims that devotion to the saints is not just a matter of faith, but of power. His words echoed like thunder. The Church has divided itself between intercession and idolatry without realizing it. This statement has sparked unease among the faithful and discomfort within the walls of the Vatican. For if it is true, prayer to the saints may not be what we have always believed. Perhaps behind each invocation lies a subtle inversion of faith, a spiritual distraction that diverts attention from the divine essence. And now the big question arises. Does God hear when we pray using other names? Or does our faith get lost among the echoes of voices that have already fulfilled their mission? The answer, according to this expert, is hidden in the subtext of the Scriptures, in forgotten passages, in symbols distorted over the centuries. And that is what he decided to reveal to the world, even knowing that his words could shake a tradition of more than 1,000 years. The Vatican, silent, observes. And while the world tries to comprehend the weight of this revelation, the question becomes inevitable. How far does faith end, and where does deception begin? But that's just the tip of the iceberg. What is about to be revealed goes far beyond prayers and images. The true secret about the saints could completely change how we view spirituality, divine mediation, and even the very meaning of worship. Get ready, because what comes next is not theory. It's revelation. Before we continue, pause for a moment and reflect. What did you feel when you heard all this? Doubt, curiosity, perhaps a deep discomfort, as if something inside you had been confronted by an ancient truth. That's exactly what this content evokes, and that's why your comment below is essential. I want to know what you think, what you believe, what troubles you, because this discussion is not just theological, it's spiritual. Leave your comment and tell us, do you believe that praying to saints brings you closer to God or distances you from Him? Your opinion is part of this debate that the world avoids, but that needs to be brought to light. And if you feel that this topic is important, if you want to understand how far the truth has been hidden, then leave your like right now. This shows that there are people willing to delve deeply into what many prefer not to question. The likes and subscriptions are the fuel that keeps this spiritual investigation alive. Press on sign up, turn on notifications, because what's about to be revealed in the next parts of this video goes beyond tradition. It touches the very heart of faith. You are about to hear what the Vatican has never wanted to admit publicly. Now that you've left your comment, like and subscribed, we can move on. Get ready. Because what comes next isn't just history. It's a revelation. Candles flicker before ancient images, casting vivid shadows on the church walls. Each flame seems to breathe, as if holding within it the whisper of centuries of faith. Men, women, and children kneel, clasp their hands, and raise their eyes before the stone and wooden figures representing the saints. Serene faces, sculpted eyes gazing upwards, robes painted in shades of gold and red, symbols of celestial glory. It is a ritual that seems to have been born with time, repeated generation after generation, in every part of the world where the name of God is pronounced. From the grand cathedrals of the Vatican to the small chapels hidden in the narrow streets of Latin America, images of saints have become bridges between the human and the divine. In every corner, someone is asking St. Jude for help with an impossible miracle, St. Anthony for a lost love, St. Rita for a desperate cause. For many, they are not just sacred reminders. They are invisible companions, friends from heaven who understand the pain of mortals. That is why millions turn to them, believing that these intercessors have the power to carry their prayers directly to God. But almost no one asks how it all began, how devotion to the saints became so prevalent, so natural, that many don't even realize how much it has shaped the Christianity we know today. This tradition was not born by chance. It was built, brick by brick, over centuries of faith, fear, and spiritual need. In the beginning, the first Christians venerated the martyrs, men and women who died for their faith. Their stories were told in secret, their tombs visited at night, their relics hidden from the authorities. These were times of persecution, and remembering these names was remembering that faith could cost one's life. Over time, these martyrs became symbols of courage and unwavering faith. People began to pray at their graves, believing that their souls, already close to God, could intercede for the living. Thus, slowly, the cult of saints was born, a practice that began as homage and transformed into devotion. Centuries later, the Church would officially recognize some of these names as canonized saints, men and women worthy of being remembered and invoked in prayer. And that is how the Christian world began to fill with altars, reliquaries, and images, creating a permanent bridge between heaven and earth. But behind this devotion lay something more, an ancient human need to feel God in a tangible, visible, and close way. The saint became the face the faithful could see, the voice that seemed more accessible than the silence of heaven. It is easier to speak with someone who has already lived through the same pains, who understood human weakness and yet achieved holiness. The faithful who pray before an image of St. Francis believe they are speaking with someone who felt hunger, cold, and fear, someone who loved the poor and understood loneliness. This identification is powerful. It creates deep emotional bonds that the Church has recognized and strengthened over the centuries. Therefore, it is no exaggeration to say that the tradition of praying to the saints shaped the very identity of the Catholic faith. It permeated prayers, festivals, city names, promises, and even popular songs. People learned that each saint has a specific spiritual function. Some protect, others heal, others open paths, and this map of intercessors spread like a web of light across the world. Everywhere there is a saint who listens, an altar that receives promises, an image that bears witness to human suffering. However, within this symbolic beauty, there is also a fine line that many do not perceive. The act of veneration, when repeated for centuries, can transform into something different from the original intention. The boundary between veneration and worship is almost invisible, and it is at this point that faith, without realizing it, risks going astray. Many believers do not pray a God but the saint, hoping that he will accomplish what the Creator himself may not grant. This subtle shift is what raises questions within the Church itself. What was meant to be intercession becomes for some idolatry masked as devotion, but it's necessary to understand the heart of this tradition before judging it, because humankind has always sought mediations to the divine. Since ancient times, humankind has erected symbols, statues, temples. It has always wanted to touch what is invisible. Prayer to the saints is, in a way, a sincere attempt to reach God through those who have already walked that same path. The intention is pure, but the danger is real, when the symbol begins to occupy the place of the source itself. While many see only art or representation in the images, others feel something alive, almost conscious in them. How many times does a believer kneel before a saint and say, "I know you hear me"? There is faith in that, but also a profound spiritual transference, something that goes beyond the simple act of remembering. It is an emotional and energetic surrender that, according to some Vatican theologians, needs to be understood with caution. Behind the scenes of the Church, the topic is delicate. There are ancient documents, discussions among theologians, and internal debates that few know about. Some say that the Church never encouraged the veneration of saints, only permitted it. Others claim that this practice has become a necessary pillar to sustain popular faith, a link between the people and the sacred. But the fact is that this tradition has grown so much that it has surpassed institutional control. Today, in many countries, the saint is better known than Christ himself. The name of the intercessor is invoked more often than the name of the Savior. And it is at this point that the true spiritual conflict begins. When faith is transferred, even unconsciously, the center of devotion shifts. The figure of the saint comes to occupy the throne of the heart, and the Creator, silent, observes. This subtle inversion is what has aroused the concern of some scholars within the Vatican, including that expert who decided to expose the truths that few dare to discuss. He realized that the problem lies not only in the images or the prayers, but in the hidden intention of those who utter them. Because what truly defines a prayer? The words or the destiny of the soul that utters them? When someone asks for a miracle, are they asking God or the echo of a tradition that has become habit? These questions need to be asked even if they are uncomfortable. It is through them that faith matures. So, before moving on, think for a moment. Have you ever wondered why you feel more comfortable praying to a saint than directly to God? What is it about this symbolic connection that generates so much trust, so much emotion, so much hope? Perhaps the answer lies in the roots of the human heart itself, in the need to see, touch, and hear something when the invisible seems too distant. And that is precisely why the next part of this investigation is essential. Because what will be revealed will expose how this seemingly innocent practice became one of the most controversial points in the spiritual history of humanity. Before we continue, I want you to comment below with a simple sentence. I want to understand the truth about praying to the saints. Write this in the comments if you feel you need to see beyond tradition, if you want to discover what really lies behind this age-old custom. Your comment shows that you are ready to go deeper, because what comes next will completely change the way you see faith, intercession, and the very power of prayer. And that's when everything began to change. The same people who once saw the saints as mirrors of holiness began to see them as possible substitutes for God himself. A silent tremor began to grow in the heart of the Church. Within the cold walls of the Vatican, doubt echoed like a forbidden voice. Were we confusing devotion with worship? Had love for the saints become a deviation from the true faith? This question spread like wildfire among theologians, priests, and the faithful, reopening old wounds that many had tried to hide under the veil of tradition. Once born, the doubt could no longer be silenced. Imagine the weight of that for someone who has always lit a candle before the image of a saint, believing that gesture ascended straight to heaven. For someone who grew up hearing stories of miracles, apparitions, fulfilled promises. The human heart is shaped by faith, and when that faith is questioned, something within us breaks. It's the fear of being wrong, of having believed purely, and yet still being far from the truth. This is the kind of agony that spans centuries. The tension between tradition and revelation, between what is taught and what is truly divine. Theologians began to divide. Some said that prayer to the saints is merely intercession, a request to heavenly friends who plead for us before God. Others, however, argued that this practice, while seemingly innocent, risks transforming creatures into unnecessary intermediaries between man and the Creator. And it is precisely here that the paradox arises. How can such an ancient faith harbor such profound doubt? The Vatican itself, throughout the centuries, has sought careful words to define the boundary between veneration and adoration. The difference seems simple in theory, but in practice, how many times is this line crossed without us realizing it? In ancient villages, images were the gospel for the illiterate. People looked at the sculptures and saw in them the face of hope. The saints were the heroes of faith, martyrs, prophets, warriors of the Spirit. They became the bridge between heaven and earth. But time, slow and relentless, began to confuse this bridge with destiny itself. The gaze that once sought God began to fix on the wood, the painting, the gold of the altars. Prayers began to be directed to names, not to the name. And when devotion mixes with worship, the soul risks losing itself without realizing it. The Vatican knew this. Documents, councils, and catechisms attempted to preserve the balance. We do not worship the saints, they said. We only ask for their intercession. But does the human heart know how to differentiate when it is kneeling? Does emotion distinguish theology? When a mother lights a candle asking St. Joseph for her son, or when someone implores St. Anthony for an impossible love, is the feeling merely devotion, or is something deeper happening there unconsciously? It is at this point that the mystery intensifies and fear creeps in. Idolatry in the Bible has always been the greatest enemy of pure faith. Since the time of Moses, God warned, "You shall not make for yourself an idol, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them." But the human heart, fragile and visually oriented, has always sought something tangible. The doubt arises precisely here, not in the gesture, but in the intention. And this is what Vatican theologians have been studying for decades, the boundary between symbolic faith and unconscious idolatry. When does a devotional gesture become an act of worship? When does the remembrance of a saint become a substitute for the divine presence? Some scholars argue that the error lies not in honoring the saints, but in transferring to them the power that belongs only to God. Others, more radical, say that even intercession is a dangerous deviation, since Christ is the only mediator between God and men. The topic divides, moves, and provokes. And the most interesting thing is that the more the Vatican tries to clarify, the more confused the people seem to become, because faith, unlike theology, does not live on definitions. It lives on experiences, and these experiences are powerful. Many swear they have seen lights, heard voices, received healings and miracles through prayers to the saints. These are accounts that the Vatican investigates cautiously, neither denying nor confirming them, because the mystery of faith cannot be contained in human formulas. And yet the question continues to echo. What is really happening when someone kneels before an image and says, "Pray for us"? Is it just faith? Or something deeper? Something that transcends the limits of worship and enters the territory of spiritual idolatry? It is a topic that divides hearts and challenges centuries of tradition. The conflict between devotion and truth, between emotion and doctrine, between love for the saints and absolute fidelity to the Creator. A dilemma that John himself, in Revelation, experienced when he prostrated himself before an angel and heard, "Do not do that. Worship only God." This scene, hidden within the pages of Revelation, seems to echo even today, like a forgotten warning. And perhaps that is precisely what the Vatican has been trying to understand in silence. Devotion is a bond of love, but also a mirror of the soul. And when the mirror reflects the creature more than the Creator, something needs to be questioned. Are we really asking for intercession, or are we seeking intermediaries to reassure us, because it is easier to speak with a saint than to face God himself? This is the root of the doubt that is reborn in each generation. Now tell me in the comments what you think about this. Do you believe that praying to saints is legitimate intercession or disguised idolatry? Write in the comments. I want to understand the truth. That this helps the video reach more people and, most importantly, shows that you are seeking something deeper than the outward appearance of faith. And it was at this point that something unthinkable happened. A theologian, a respected man within the walls of the Vatican, someone who had dedicated his entire life to studying the mysteries of faith, decided to speak, to break the silence, to break with the tradition of secrecy. He was not just any dissident, not a rebel seeking fame or scandal. He was an insider, a connoisseur of the archives that rarely see the light of day. His name was whispered in the corridors, but never spoken publicly. What he brought was not just an opinion, it was a revelation. For years, this man served on one of the theological commissions responsible for reviewing ancient texts and analyzing forgotten documents. He knew intimately the manuscripts that tell of what the Church experienced, feared, and concealed. And according to him, there is much more to devotion to the saints than the public ever imagined. The story that has been told, he said, is only the surface of an ocean of contradictions and interpretations that have changed over the centuries. Among the documents he revealed were accounts from popes, letters from bishops, and notes from councils, texts that showed how the Church at different times tried to balance faith and idolatry, devotion and heresy. He claimed that in the early days of Christianity, the practice of praying to saints did not exist in the way we know it today. It grew slowly, adapting to cultures, absorbing local customs, until it became one of the pillars of popular spirituality. And the Vatican, for a long time, had tried to manage this phenomenon without ever extinguishing it, for fear of losing the emotional connection with the people. The theologian said he had found something deeper in the archives, a kind of veiled confession from ancient church leaders. In one of the documents, a 16th-century cardinal admitted that popular faith tends to transform the symbol into substance, acknowledging the risk of devotion to saints exceeding the limits of theology and becoming practical worship. This revelation, according to the expert, showed that the Vatican always knew of the danger but chose to maintain control through the pedagogy of faith, avoiding a sudden rupture that could divide the Church. But what was most striking was the discovery of ancient theological interpretations that asserted that every act of prayer should be directed solely and exclusively to God, even when the name of a saint was pronounced. "The saints do not hear," one of the translated texts stated. "It is God who hears through them." A subtle, almost poetic explanation, but one that, according to the expert, was lost in the layers of tradition and popular custom. Theology became devotion, and devotion became spiritual practice. The impact of the revelations was immense. Within the Vatican, some called him a traitor. Others, in silence, admitted that his words sounded like an echo of something many already knew but dared not say. He also mentioned the weight of centuries of images, sculptures, rituals and festivities created around the saints, and how all of this, little by little, created an almost uncontrollable emotional system. Faith became visible, palpable, aesthetic, but the more visible it became, the further it seemed from the invisible divine. According to him, the most sensitive point is this: human beings have always needed visual intermediaries because the presence of God, in its purity, is overwhelming. So the human mind created comforting representations. But comfort can become a spiritual prison, the expert said, because man begins to seek the saint instead of seeking the spirit. He begins to converse with images when he should be listening to the silence. This phrase, taken from his notes, resonated with theologians worldwide and reignited the debate about the true purpose of prayer. In an unofficial interview, he revealed that he had found a series of internal correspondences between authorities and scholars of the faith, discussing how to deal with the advance of Protestant criticism during the Reformation. Many leaders, fearing the loss of faithful, decided to reinforce the veneration of saints as a distinctive mark of the Catholic Church. It was a strategic choice, not just a spiritual one. This decision, according to the theologian, shaped centuries of religious behavior and consolidated the habit of praying to saints, transforming it into a symbol of Catholic identity more than a biblical principle. But what drew the most attention was his latest revelation. He said that in a sealed file, he found a marginal note made by an early translator of biblical texts, stating that the very term intercession of the saints had been reinterpreted over time. Originally, it referred to their testimony and example, not to direct prayer. In other words, the idea that the saints hear and answer came much later, and that for him changes everything. The reaction within the Vatican was intense. Some authorities asked for his silence, others discreetly transferred him to distant positions, removing him from central commissions. But it was too late. His words had already slipped out. They leaked. They circulated among scholars, religious journalists, and even curious faithful who began to question, what else does the Vatican know and not reveal? What truths are kept behind the closed doors of the Holy See? And here's the point that captivates the audience, because contrary to what many think, the Catholic faith has never denied mystery. It manages it. The Vatican has always understood that there are truths that the people are not ready to hear. But when a man from within decides to break that code of silence, the whole world needs to listen. Not out of rebellion, but out of love for the truth. The theologian did not speak with anger. He spoke with sadness. He said that his intention was not to destroy the faith, but to purify it. Truth, he affirmed, is the highest act of devotion. And this phrase became a mantra among those who began to see devotion to the saints with different eyes. Not as something forbidden, but as something that needs to be understood in the light of what Christ taught. No one comes to the Father except through me. Think about it. If even within the Vatican there are voices willing to question centuries of tradition, what does this reveal about the current state of faith? Is part of what we call devotion actually clinging to custom? Are we willing to relinquish the comfort of images to seek the living presence of the Spirit? Now tell me in the comments, Do you think the Vatican is hiding some of the truth about the saints? Write the sentence. I want to see what is hidden. That way, I'll know you came here seeking enlightenment and not just out of curiosity. And it was then that the thin line began to become visible. That silent boundary between faith and custom, between the sacred and the symbolic. The Vatican expert, in his calm and firm words, stated that the greatest error in religious history was not devotion, but confusion. He said that the difference between intercession and adoration is the point where faith is tested, where the human heart reveals to whom it truly surrenders. And this point, according to him, has been blurred over the centuries until it almost disappeared. Think about it. Official doctrine teaches that saints are not gods, but intercessors, faithful servants who, having lived in grace, stand before God and can intercede for the living. In theory, it's a spiritual bridge, an aid on the path of prayer, but in practice, what the expert showed is that many have crossed this line without even realizing it. He said that the human mind, driven by the need to touch the divine, began to create emotional shortcuts, and these shortcuts became habits. The saint's name began to replace the name of God, and supplication to the Creator was transformed into supplication to the creature. The problem, according to him, lies not in veneration, but in the transfer of spiritual power. Because when prayer loses its focus, the heart loses its direction. He cited clear examples: altars where the name of Christ is small and the name of the saint dominates the space, rituals in which people ask the saint for what only the Spirit could grant, promises made not to God, but to human figures elevated to invisible thrones. And that is where the conflict arises, the point at which love mixes with idolatry and faith becomes ritual without discernment. The theologian described this as a grey area of faith. He said, "The faithful believe they are honoring heaven, but sometimes they are merely projecting their need onto something they can see." And this is the spiritual dilemma that echoes throughout the history of the Church. Human beings seek intercession because they fear God's silence. They want quick answers, visible signs, immediate comfort. It's natural. But the danger is that this comfort, over time, replaces the sincere search for the Creator. And what's most impressive is that the expert revealed that this dilemma is not new. It was already debated among the early church fathers. In ancient texts, he found clear warnings about the risk of confusing honor with worship. One of them said, "Honor those who sleep in the Lord, but worship only him who conquered death." And this distinction was simple, direct, but it was lost as the centuries transformed the spiritual into tradition and the mystery into custom. He further stated that over time, the liturgy itself reinforced this confusion. Prayers, chants, and festivities began to revolve around the saints, as if they were autonomous sources of power. Language shapes faith, the theologian said, and when language changes, the spirit also changes. The insistence on asking Saint so-and-so or Saint so-and-so for something that only God can grant ended up creating such a strong emotional connection that in many places Christ became a distant symbol, and the saints, the direct interlocutors. But the most delicate point is what he called the unconscious transfer of worship. According to him, it's a subtle spiritual phenomenon. A person begins by venerating an example, but ends up placing all their hope in it. It begins with reverence, it ends with dependence, and when dependence sets in, the sacred loses its center. He said that this is the oldest trap of the human spirit, transforming mediators into idols and idols into spiritual crutches. The expert went further. He said that even within the Vatican, there are silent divisions on this issue. Some argue that devotion to saints is necessary to maintain the bond with ordinary people, while others see it as a dangerous theological deviation. He even cited an internal document that warned against the excessive personalization of faith. In other words, when faith becomes focused on human figures, it ceases to be universal. And this loss of focus is what the expert called the forgetting of the Lamb. This expression, the forgetting of the Lamb, resonated strongly among scholars. He explained that when the figure of the saint becomes the center of spiritual experience, the sacrifice of Christ is overshadowed. Not because the faithful consciously deny it, but because daily devotion diverts the gaze. Love that does not turn to the Lamb turns to the image, he said. And this phrase became almost a prophetic warning within theological circles. What is most disconcerting is that the theologian did not speak in a cold or doctrinaire manner. He spoke with pain, like someone who still loves the church and fears for it. He said that it is not a matter of condemning devotion, but of restoring its meaning. Because, according to him, even the saints, if they could speak, would say, "Do not look at us. Look at him who sanctified us." That, according to him, was true intercession, pointing to Christ, never replacing him. And that's when he posed the question that shook the religious world. When you pray to a saint who is listening, him or the God who dwells beyond time? This question resonates like spiritual thunder. Because it disarms tradition, exposes faith, and compels each person to look inward, it is a mirror of the soul. According to the expert, the problem is not invoking the name of a saint, but forgetting the purpose of the invocation. If prayer arises from faith in God, it is intercession. But if it arises from the fear of not being heard, it becomes disguised worship. And that is the most dangerous spiritual boundary of all, the one that is crossed with good intentions, but ends up distancing the believer from the divine essence. He spoke of it with an unsettling serenity, like someone carrying a truth no one wants to hear. God doesn't need intermediaries to hear the human cry, he said. The saints weren't called to receive requests, but to inspire lives. And this statement, so simple and direct, shattered centuries of emotional constructs. Because it strikes at the heart of the matter. To whom are we truly praying? It's a powerful thought, isn't it? Perhaps modern faith has become too accustomed to the presence of saints, images, and rituals. And perhaps, without realizing it, many have replaced their relationship with the divine with a cycle of requests, promises, and repetitions. It's as if faith has become automatic, a mechanical tradition, and not a real encounter with the sacred. And the theologian concluded one of his most striking speeches by saying that true intercession is when the life of a saint inspires us to seek God, not when he becomes a substitute for the divine presence. The saint is the mirror, he said, but the light comes from another source. Now I want you to think about this calmly. Do you believe that the boundary between intercession and worship is still respected today? Or has that line become blurred over time? Write the phrase in the comments. I want to see the line, to show that you are among the few who still seek to understand the difference between true faith and custom that has become comfortable. The expert, with a deep voice and a gaze laden with unsettling truth, opens an old Bible. The pages, yellowed with age, seem to breathe a forgotten mystery. He slowly runs his finger over the verses, as if touching something too sacred to be spoken aloud. And then he speaks. Here, he says, is where it all begins. The sacred text itself warned from the beginning about the dangers of improper mediation, about the risk of transforming the holy into a new idol. Those words cut through the air like invisible blades. The room falls silent, and it is in that instant that doubt transforms into unease. Could it be that at some point in history, the line between intercession and worship was truly crossed? He opens to Deuteronomy and reads slowly, "You shall have no other gods before me." A short phrase but laden with eternity. The problem, according to him, is that over the centuries, the symbol became the center, the intermediary became the object, and the focus of faith shifted from the creator to the creature. What was merely a request for intercession, he explains, gradually transformed into spiritual dependence. People stopped looking to heaven and began looking to statues. And this statement carries weight. Because it doesn't just attack tradition, it touches the hearts of millions of believers who grew up believing that this practice was a legitimate form of devotion. But the expert doesn't speak with anger or contempt. He speaks with pain. When you read the gospel, he continues, you realize that there is only one mediator between God and men, Christ. This quote from Timothy resonates like thunder in the soul of the listener. It brings clarity, but also conflict. Because faith, when confronted, hurts. And the most frightening thing is realizing that many who pray to the saints do so sincerely, believing with all their hearts that they are pleasing God. But sincerity by itself does not define truth. And that is what the theologian tries to explain, the difference between intention and direction. He shows another text, this time from Isaiah, where the prophet condemns the people for making images and calling them deities. With half the wood they warm themselves, and with the other half they make a god and worship it. The words sound ancient, but the meaning remains alive. This isn't just about sculptures, he says. It's about the human heart. It's about the desire to have something visible to represent the invisible. It's about the fragility of faith. And then he takes us to an even deeper point, the human need for intermediaries. Why did the people ask Moses to speak to God for them, he asks. Why have men always sought prophets, priests, saints? Because it's easier to speak to someone who seems closer than to the Creator himself. And here lies the paradox. The more we seek spiritual shortcuts, the further we stray from the source. He pauses. He closes the Bible and looks at the audience. Idolatry doesn't begin with statues, he says. It begins with distraction. When the focus shifts from the glory of God to devotion to anything else, even if it seems good, the error has already begun. And this is the wound that few want to touch, because idolatry in a spiritual context is not always explicit. Sometimes it disguises itself as love, tradition, or respect, but within it there is something that takes the place of God, and that is the danger. The Bible repeats this warning in numerous passages, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Psalms, all crying out against the deviation of worship. The problem lies not only in those who kneel, but in those who forget the reason for kneeling. I'm not saying we should erase the saints from history, he continues. They are examples of faith, yes. They are witnesses. But the line is thin. When a heart begins to trust more in the figure of the saint than in the presence of the Holy Spirit, faith changes direction. And it is at this point that intercession becomes idolatry. These words bring discomfort because they reveal something that many prefer to ignore. True faith demands discernment, and discernment is painful. The expert quotes Paul when the apostle warns, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Idolatry is at its core a form of spiritual conformity. It is the desire to touch the divine easily, without going through the process of inner transformation. He then points to something many had never noticed. The scriptures don't ask us to speak with the saints, but to be like them, to imitate their faith, not their position. This phrase resonates like a revelation, because it changes everything. The focus isn't on asking them to do something for us, but on living as they lived, with the same dedication, the same courage, and the same love for the Creator. And here he goes beyond theology. The problem, he says, is that faith has become a system of outsourcing. Man wants miracles but doesn't want intimacy. He wants blessings but doesn't want commitment. He wants salvation but doesn't want the cross. These words hit like a blow of reality, because they describe exactly the spiritual state of our time. Intercession, in its purest sense, is asking someone to pray for us. That's biblical. But worship is surrender, and that belongs only to God. When someone lights a candle believing that the saint will answer on their own, something breaks in the essence of faith. It's as if the direct link with the divine is replaced by a human intermediary. And it is this type of practice that the Vatican, according to the expert, has begun to re-evaluate behind the scenes. There are documents, debates, and internal concerns about the extent to which popular devotion has transformed into spiritual dependence. But before revealing the contents of these documents, which promise to change how many view faith, he makes a request to those listening. Reflect on this. Read the scriptures with an open heart. Ask yourself if your faith is anchored in Christ or in traditions. And now, before we continue, I want you to stop for a moment and think about this too. How many times have you prayed seeking something visible, something tangible, something that would make you feel closer to the divine? How many times has the figure of the saint become more present than God himself? If this topic makes you think, comment below. I want to understand the truth. Write this down, because this comment shows that you are seeking discernment. And if you feel that this content is making you see something that previously went unnoticed, leave your like now. This helps this video reach more people who are also seeking answers. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now, because what comes next will profoundly shake everything you believed about intercession, the saints, and true worship. Don't go away, because the next part will reveal what the Vatican discovered and why this revelation was never fully made public. If God is love, why does his judgment on idolatry sound so harsh? This question cuts through the silence like an invisible blade and echoes within those who seek to understand the divine mind. The paradox between love and judgment seems like an abyss, but in truth, it is the place where the essence of love reveals itself in its purest form, because to truly love is to correct. It is to protect the beloved from that which destroys them, even when they do not understand. Love without correction is not love, it is omission, and omission, in the spiritual context, is the seed of perdition. God's love is not sentimental, it is justice in action. It is the fire that purifies, not the one that consumes for pleasure. When idolatry takes hold, it not only diverts the faithful's gaze, it breaks the bond between creator and creature. And judgment arises not as punishment, but as an act of redemption. It is love saying, "Return to me." And it is at this point that most fail to understand the divine heart, because judgment, however painful it may seem, is the instrument that love uses to realign the path. Imagine a father watching his son run towards a precipice. He shouts, he warns, he punishes if necessary, not because he desires suffering, but because he desires life. The same occurs in the spiritual dimension. When God judges idolatry, he is not harming man, he is freeing him from the lie that imprisons him. Judgment is love's way of saying, enough. It is the limit set to prevent error from turning into eternal damnation. Throughout Scripture, the pattern is the same. The people stray, create substitutes, and God intervenes, always, not out of anger, but out of zeal. "I am the Lord your God, a jealous God," says the sacred text. Zeal is the form of love that refuses to share the beloved's heart with false gods. Zeal is the holy jealousy of love that does not tolerate spiritual infidelity. But why does humanity insist on replacing the infinite with symbols? Because idolatry is comfortable. It's easier to deal with images, figures, intermediaries. It's easier to worship the tangible than to surrender to the invisible. Idolatry offers emotional security, but it robs us of spiritual depth. It's a form of superficial faith, a reflection of the human need to control the sacred, and judgment comes precisely to break this illusory control. Divine love does not seek blind submission, but conscious transformation. It judges in order to awaken. It exposes error in order to restore communion. It is like gold being refined. Extreme heat does not destroy, it only separates the pure from the impure. Judgment is the heat that removes what hinders the brilliance of truth. The Vatican expert, who had already revealed the ancient texts and interpretations, now explains something deeper. Judgment is not punishment. It is spiritual surgery. And this phrase changes everything, because it shows that judgment is part of love, a love that does not tolerate the spiritual disease of idolatry. It does not destroy, it heals. This understanding is the turning point in faith. It is the moment when the soul realizes that divine severity is, in fact, a reflection of absolute mercy. Judgment is the shield of purity. It preserves the sanctity of the relationship between God and man. When the faithful bow before something that is not the Creator, they deviate from the axis of worship. And this deviation, though it may seem small, is the beginning of separation. Love does not accept this. True love is radical. It cuts evil at the root. And that is why God judges. Because he loves too much to allow wrongdoing to continue. Idolatry is not just about statues, it's about emotional and spiritual dependence. It's about exchanging the living presence of God for comfortable representations. Judgment is the cry of love demanding authenticity. It's important to understand, when the Bible speaks of judgment, it speaks of restoration. When it speaks of wrath, it speaks of justice. When it speaks of condemnation, it speaks of liberation from falsehood. God does not destroy for pleasure, he disciplines to heal. Idolatry breaks the spiritual order of the universe, and love restores that order. There is a moment when the expert opens an ancient manuscript and reads a forgotten phrase in Latin: love judges in order to save. Love judges in order to save. That's it. That's the essence of everything. Love doesn't remain silent. Love confronts, and that confrontation is what differentiates idolatry from true faith. When God judges, he reveals what man hides. He exposes deception. He tears the veil. And in doing so, he restores spiritual freedom. That is why, every time Scripture speaks of idolatry, it also speaks of return, of repentance, of reconciliation. Because love does not give up, it pursues to the end, and this divine pursuit is what many call a trial. But in truth, it is an invitation. God judges sin, but seeks the sinner. He cuts off error, but welcomes those who desire to change. That is why judgment is inseparable from love. Without judgment, love would be permissive, and permissive love does not save. It only soothes while the soul is lost. This is the truth that many don't want to hear, because judgment forces change. It forces introspection. It forces one to acknowledge one's own wrongdoing. But those who understand God's love know that the pain of correction is temporary and its fruit is eternal. Now think about this. If God is love, can he remain silent in the face of error? Can he ignore the idolatry that imprisons millions in spiritual dependencies? Can he passively watch while the human heart exchanges the living light of faith for the shadow of human traditions? Of course not. True love is not neutral. It takes a stand. It intervenes. It shakes things up. It awakens. And perhaps that is what is happening now. Perhaps the world is being called to a new spiritual awakening, a return to the center. Perhaps the judgment that so many fear is, in fact, the greatest demonstration of love that has ever existed. If you're feeling something different while listening to this, a restlessness, a calling, a desire to understand more, it's a sign that the Spirit is touching something within you. Write this down in the comments. Love awakens me to the truth. This simple phrase shows that you understood the purpose of this message, and if you want to continue with me on this journey, leave your like now. It helps this video reach more people who also need to understand the true meaning of divine judgment and love. And if you haven't signed up yet, do it now, because in the next section, we're going to enter the most delicate territory of all, what really happens when love judges the Church, and what the Vatican is afraid to reveal about it. When the experts' revelations began to circulate within the Vatican walls, the silence was deafening. No official statement, no retraction, no denial, just that dense silence that precedes a storm. And that silence for many spoke louder than any words. It was the kind of silence born not of ignorance, but of fear. Fear of what might come to light if the truth were fully revealed. In the ancient corridors, among tapestries and shadows, the rumor spread like wildfire. A theologian had spoken aloud what many had always suspected, but never dared to write. Internal meetings multiplied. The words heresy and disobedience began to be whispered. Some saw his statements as a betrayal, others a prophetic act. The Vatican, accustomed to controlling the narrative of faith, now found itself facing a theological bomb about to explode. And most disturbingly, it had been lit within its own walls. Cardinals and bishops began to divide. On one side, the defenders of tradition, affirming that the veneration of saints is a historical pillar, a bridge between the human and the divine. On the other, those who saw in the experts' words a call for the purification of faith, a return to the center of the gospel. In the middle of this crossfire, the people, confused, divided, not knowing whom to believe. Some faithful reacted with disbelief. How could something so beautiful, so pure be condemned? They said. Others felt a profound shock, as if the very foundation of their faith had suddenly split in two. Some wept, not from anger, but from fear, because to admit that something practiced for centuries could be at odds with the divine plan was to admit that error had infiltrated prayers, celebrations, and even the very walls of the churches. Amid the confusion, old documents, internal reports, and secret debates began to surface. Some claimed that certain popes had raised similar doubts centuries ago, but were silenced to preserve the unity of the Church. Others said the revelation was a disguised attack, an attempt to weaken papal authority. But the fact is that for the first time in a long time, the Vatican found itself forced to look inward and confront an uncomfortable question. Where does tradition end and idolatry begin? Older theologians tried to contain the flame with careful speeches, attempting to reinterpret what the expert had said. It's not about abolishing the saints, they said, but about understanding their place in the economy of salvation. However, the more they tried to explain, the more the public became interested. The internet became a spiritual battleground. Videos, articles, live streams, all debating the same issue. Are we praying to the saints or replacing God with them? The Vatican knew that any response would be dangerous. If it denied the revelation, it would seem to be hiding something. If it confirmed it, it would open a wound impossible to heal. Therefore, it opted for a third way: silence. A calculated political protective silence. But outside, the world did not remain silent. The topic spread through forums, religious channels and conferences. Faithful people began to study the scriptures on their own, seeking to understand what was really written about intercession and worship. This movement sparked a kind of silent reform. Ordinary people began to question their own prayers. Some removed images of saints from their homes, saying they wanted to speak directly to God. Others reaffirmed their devotion, arguing that the saints are part of the heavenly communion and intercede for the living. Faith became a battleground, and in every spiritual war, the first impact happens within the soul. Meanwhile, within the Vatican walls, the divisions became more visible. Some argued that the theologian should be excommunicated. Others called for dialogue, and some simply disappeared from the discussions as if advised to remain silent. The expert, now isolated, was summoned to retract his statement, but he did not. He only said one sentence: "If truth is in the fire, burn what is false." This phrase spread around the world. It became a symbol of spiritual resistance. And for many, it was the beginning of something bigger. Local churches began to feel the effects. Faithful questioned priests, asking for explanations about the basis of the veneration. Some priests refused to answer, claiming that faith should not be discussed but lived. Others, more daring, admitted in a low voice, "There are things we need to review." From then on, the church began to face an identity crisis. The issue of saints was only the surface of something deeper, the fear of losing control of popular faith, because what was at stake was not just doctrine, but authority. If the faithful began to seek God directly, without intermediaries, the role of the institution would change, and this, within the Vatican, was viewed with caution. But there's something curious about truth. It has a subtle way of spreading. You don't need to shout it, just say it once in the right tone, and it will echo for centuries. And that's what happened. The theologian's words began to be repeated in independent sermons, in small prayer groups, in networks of believers who wished to return to the purity of the gospel. Some called this movement the New Reformation of the Spirit. Others preferred to call it the return to first love. But for the Vatican, it was a real problem, because quietly, a segment of the population was rediscovering faith without needing traditional structures. And then the leaks began. Internal documents, confidential discussions, unauthorized recordings, everything started to emerge, as if something beyond human control was pushing the truth out of the shadows. And the question that echoed was simple, yet devastating. The Vatican is afraid of the truth, or of the reaction it might cause. While religious authorities tried to contain the chaos, the expert continued speaking. His increasingly symbolic interviews mixed theology with prophecy. He said that the church was being purified from within, that judgment would begin with the house of God. Many called him a visionary, others a madman. But no one remained indifferent, and perhaps that was the purpose of it all, to provoke the discomfort that awakens, because true faith is not comfortable, it questions, it demands transformation. And that is exactly what was beginning to happen, a spiritual transformation on a global scale, born from within the very heart of the church. Now the inevitable question lingers. What will happen when the Vatican is forced to speak out, when the weight of the revelation can no longer be contained within the silence of the ancient walls, when the people demand a direct answer? If you've made it this far, write in the comments. The truth cannot be hidden. And tell me what you think the Vatican is afraid to reveal. I want to see where this reflection will take you, because in the next chapter, we're going to cross a line the Vatican never wanted the world to cross. When the expert, weary of the pressure and veiled threats, finally decided to speak openly, the atmosphere was almost apocalyptic. The Vatican was trying to put out fires in all directions, but the flames of spiritual curiosity had already spread throughout the world. People wanted answers. They wanted to know why, after centuries, someone connected to the inner workings of the church was saying something so simple and yet so devastating. True worship does not belong to the saints, nor to the angels, nor to any image. It belongs solely to Christ. The revelation came not in an accusatory tone, but with clarity. He spoke neither with anger nor disdain. He spoke with the serenity of someone who had understood something that transcended the walls of institutions. The saints, he said, are like windows, not like walls. They point to the light, but they are not the light. This phrase became a symbol of a new way of understanding faith. because what he was proposing was not the end of devotion, but its purification. For centuries, the relationship between the people and the saints became emotional, intimate, almost familial. Simple people placed their hopes, their fears, and their sorrows in the hands of those they considered intercessors. But the expert stated that, little by little, this devotion went astray. The symbolic gesture of asking for prayer has transformed, in many cases, into spiritual dependence. And when devotion takes the place of worship, the line between faith and idolatry blurs. According to him, the real danger was never the image itself, but the human heart, which seeks intermediaries because it fears direct contact with the divine. It's easier to pray to someone we feel close to, he said, than to face the living God, whose presence reveals who we truly are. And perhaps that was the central point of the revelation. Human beings seek comfort even in their spirituality, but the path of Christ was never comfortable. It was a path of confrontation, purification, and transformation. In his lectures and interviews, the expert explained that the message of the saints was always to point to Christ, not to replace him. They were witnesses of the faith, not recipients of worship. And over the centuries, the original meaning has been diluted, suffocated by popular traditions, superstitions, and the human need to touch the invisible. He showed ancient excerpts from letters of church fathers, in which the saints themselves asked, "Do not worship us, follow him who sanctified us." But this clarity did not please everyone. Within the churches, many priests feared that this new light would destabilize the people. If we remove the saints, they said, people will lose their emotional connection to the faith. The expert, however, responded firmly, "The connection cannot be in the symbol, but in the origin. When love for God is real, it does not need intermediaries." And it is at this point that the revelation becomes deeper. He affirmed that true worship is not something done with words or external gestures, but a state of the heart that surrenders to the divine presence. The true altar is not in cathedrals or golden temples, but in the spirit of those who sincerely seek the truth. Christ, he said, did not found a religion of statues and hierarchies, but a living relationship between the Creator and the creature. Every sentence he uttered was like a hammer blow to the rigid structures of tradition. Some called him a reformer, others a rebel, but he said he was only echoing what was already written. "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Everything that does not lead directly to that path, he asserted, risks becoming a deviation, even if it comes wrapped in devotion and good intentions. This message began to awaken something in the people. People who had spent decades praying to saints began to look at the crucifix with different eyes. For the first time, they wondered if their prayers were reaching where they should. Not out of guilt, but out of a desire for spiritual authenticity. Faith, after so long, was being detoxified. And that's when the tension increased. Some dioceses banned the circulation of the expert's recordings. Other priests were instructed to correct his message in sermons. But it was too late. The video of the main interview had spread across the internet and, in a few days, surpassed millions of views. The world was listening and reflecting. He spoke of purifying faith with the calmness of someone who understands that spiritual fire does not destroy, but only refines. He said that God does not want to eliminate sacred memories, but to restore the lost meaning behind them. The saint who points to Christ illuminates, he said. The saint who replaces Christ obscures. It was a call for discernment, a summons to spiritual maturity. For many, it was like waking from a collective slumber. They began to realize how faith, over time, had become ritual, inheritance, custom, but not relationship. The expert stated that true prayer does not depend on formulas, but on inner truth, and that any form of worship that does not lead directly to the source of grace risks becoming a shadow. What was most surprising was the hopeful tone he maintained. Even when exposing centuries of confusion, he never spoke of destruction, but of reconstruction. For him, this revelation was not the end of an era, but the beginning of a spiritual new start. Christianity doesn't need to be destroyed, he said. It needs to be purified. And this phrase became the heart of his message. He compared the process to a river. When it is born, the water is pure, crystalline, without interference. But as the river flows, it receives residues, impurities, and what was a source becomes a mixture. What he proposed was simple: to return to the source, to return to the living Christ, where faith is simple, direct, and powerful. We don't need new mediators, he said. We need to rediscover the mediator who has always been at the center. Gradually, his words began to transform the way people prayed. Instead of repeating names, they began to invoke the Spirit. Instead of lighting candles to specific saints, they began to seek moments of silence to hear the divine voice within themselves. The expert said that this is true worship, that which springs from within, which does not depend on images, rituals, or hierarchy, but on the direct encounter between the human and the eternal. And that's when he made the statement that changed everything. Worship that doesn't lead to Christ is an empty echo. Worship that springs from him is the sound of the entire universe responding to God's love. These words reverberated like thunder in the calm. It was the kind of statement no one could ignore. Even those who disagreed felt that there was something alive there, something that transcended centuries of theology and went straight to the heart. The expert wasn't seeking applause or followers. He sought to liberate faith from the weight of distorted traditions. He said that God doesn't want man to live on the spiritual memories of others, but on his own experience. That faith is not a museum of saints, but a path of continuous transformation. And that true love always purifies what has been corrupted, not with hatred, but with light. And it is this light that began to spread, a light of hope, of return, of understanding. People began to realize that faith is not the possession of an institution, but a personal invitation to encounter the Creator. The expert said, Christ doesn't need defenders, he needs witnesses. And perhaps this is the phrase that best summarizes the entire hidden message of the revelation. He didn't want to overthrow the church. He wanted it to remember who it was called to be, the living body of Christ, not a monument of traditions. And that reminder is what disturbs him most, because it rekindles something that was dormant, pure, free, luminous faith. If you've made it this far, write in the comments. True faith points to Christ. I want to know if this revelation resonated with you. Do you believe that the true cult has been distorted over time? Tell me in the comments, because in the next part, we're going to get to the most sensitive point of this whole story, the one the Vatican tried to erase from the pages. And this is where it all comes down to. The revelation has already been made. The understanding has already been delivered. But now comes the question that no one can ignore. The one that cannot be answered with words, but with the weight of conscience and the silence of the soul. When you pray, to whom, in fact, is your faith directed? To the Creator who dwells in spirit and truth, or to the images that merely represent him? This is the question that separates ritual from experience, belief from encounter, tradition from living revelation. Because if faith is limited to the visible, then it is bound to matter. And everything that is matter wears out, breaks, fades away. But if faith rises to the invisible, then it touches the eternal. And the eternal is never corrupted. That is the difference between worshipping the symbol and recognizing the meaning. between seeking a reflection and seeing the source. And perhaps that is exactly what God has been trying to restore: the purity of the gaze, the sincerity of the heart, the fire that is not fed by rituals but by presence. The expert, in that last public meeting before his forced silence, said something that echoed throughout the auditorium. He looked at the people one by one and asked, "If all the images were destroyed, would your faith still live?" The silence that followed was almost unbearable, because that question laid bare an uncomfortable truth. Many had built their faith around representations, but few had known the living presence of Christ. And it is this absence that he called unconscious idolatry. It wasn't about prohibiting images or denying symbols. He explained that images, when understood, are beautiful reminders. The problem begins when the symbol takes the throne of devotion, when the heart places there the trust that belongs only to the Creator. He said that God doesn't seek the perfect gesture, but the true intention. And perhaps that's why Jesus said, "The hour is coming when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth." That hour, according to the expert, is now. Many leaders tried to reinterpret his words, to soften the impact. But it was too late. The flame had been lit, and the people began to question. What is worship? What is faith? What is truth? And the most interesting thing is that the more people reflected, the more they felt a deep restlessness within themselves, almost like a silent call saying, "Come back to me." Because in the end, everything converges on this point, the return to essence. Worship is not a habit, it's an encounter. And a true encounter needs no frame. It happens in the soul, in the invisible space where the mind falls silent and the spirit awakens. And when that connection happens, no image, no word, and no sound can replace it. It's the moment when the human bows before the divine, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Because finally understanding that everything sought outside was always within. And that's precisely why the final question is so powerful. It disarms, exposes, purifies. It reveals where the true center of our faith lies, because many pray, but few worship. Many speak the name of God, but few listen to him. And it is in this difference that true spiritual relationship is measured. The expert said that faith that depends on images is like a weak flame that needs wind to exist. But faith that is born of the Spirit is a fire that burns on its own. As the debate grew, some said that this vision was dangerous, that tampering with popular devotion was reopening an old wound. But he calmly replied, "It's not a wound, it's healing." Because sometimes healing hurts. Sometimes you have to break down the altar to rebuild it on the right rock. And he affirmed that the human heart is that altar. When the altar is contaminated, all worship becomes contaminated. But when the heart is purified, even silence becomes adoration. From that point on, many began to withdraw to pray in a different way. Not asking, but listening, not reciting, but feeling. And that's when the change began to happen, invisible but real. People reported peace amidst the chaos, comfort without explanation, strength without human support. It was as if a new form of faith was being born, simpler, purer, closer to the living God. But there was also the other side, the resistance. Those who couldn't stand the idea of a faith without images said that it was the same as erasing history, that it was a step backward, that the people wouldn't understand. And perhaps they were right. The truth is never easy to digest. But the expert insisted, faith is not lost when the image is removed. Faith is lost when Christ is removed from the center. The message was direct and disconcerting at the same time, because it forced each person to look inward and ask, what in fact occupies the place of God in my life? Is it the symbol, the custom, the fear, or the living presence of the Spirit? This is the question that echoes to this day, and the more time passes, the more strength it gains, because in silence we all know that something is wrong when devotion becomes mechanical, when the sacred becomes routine. The expert said that God is tired of empty words, that he seeks true worshippers, not mere repeaters of rituals. And that's the hardest part to hear because it demands change, not a change of religion, but of inner posture. It takes courage to face one's own heart and admit, perhaps I've become accustomed to talking to God, but I've never learned to listen to him. Perhaps I've clung to images because I was afraid of absence. But what if absence is precisely the space where he reveals himself? This is the paradox of faith. The more one lets go of the visible, the more one sees the invisible. And this is what few understand. True spirituality is not measured by what one sees, but by what one feels in the spirit. That is why the specialist called the process a purification of vision. It is not about erasing what has been built, but about seeing beyond, seeing Christ behind the symbol, the Creator behind creation. And when this happens, the perspective changes. The world changes. With each word, he seemed to invite the audience to make a choice. Not a choice between religion or doctrine, but between appearance and essence. "What do you want?" he asked. "A clay god that you can touch, or a living God that can touch you?" This question resonated in people's minds long after the video ended. And perhaps it continues to resonate today, in everyone who seeks something more than a simple answer. And it is at this point that I ask you, now that we have come this far together, when you kneel, is your prayer to the Creator or to the images that represent him? What moves your heart? The fear of losing the sacred or the desire to find the truth? This reflection is not meant to accuse, but to awaken, because perhaps the faith that the world needs today is not new, but restored. If you felt something different listening to this, if this message made you think, write in the comments, "My faith returns to its source." I want to know if this flame has ignited within you. Leave a like, because that shows you understood the purpose. Subscribe to the channel, because what comes next will take you even deeper on this spiritual journey. And tell me, when you pray, who are you really talking to?